Hello and welcome to the Can We Ask You This podcast. My name is Rosalind and Corey is not able to be here today, but that's okay. We will fly solo and hopefully do it justice. We have a very special guest today. Her name is Kristen, and you will have heard her story on the previous episode. If you haven't heard it, pause this episode, go back and listen. She shares her story about what it was like to be a single mom and what that was like in the church, being pregnant, having a baby. Really great story. And as we talked when she recorded her episode, we thought, wow, this really relates to the Christmas story. And so Kristen is back, and we're going to talk about the realities of what it might have been like to be Mary, who Kristen has a lot in common with. And then also what might it have been like to be Joseph and the other sort of characters in the story. And I use characters in story loosely, I guess, meaning it is a real story. It really happened. So we don't want to lose that. But yeah, we're going to dive into it, talk about what it was probably like in reality, get into the messy details of the birth of Jesus. It's going to be a really good episode. So I hope you enjoy. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so this is actually Kristen's second time here. You will have heard her story, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. If you haven't, go back and listen to her story. We're going to do a special Christmas episode today and talk about the realities of the Christmas story. And maybe it's not just a story. And what was it like to really be someone like Mary? What happened between the sentence, it came time for the baby to be born, and then the baby was born? So we're going to dive into all those realities. Don't worry, guys. This is not just a ladies episode. I'm pretty sure there were not gentlemen. Should we call them that? Just men?
Men. Maybe men.
I'm pretty sure there were men present. This is for everybody. We're going to be talking a lot about, what the Christmas story is. Kristen, I'm glad you're here. Can you give us a little background on your story?
Yes, I definitely can. So my name's Kristen. I'm a single mom, even though I don't love to use that label. It's kind of the reality of my life. I have a little 2-year-old daughter, and she's so great. I'm a teacher and just trying to figure out life. That's probably the easiest way to sum up my reality right now.
Yeah. Well, and you're someone who has been in the church forever. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Raised and grown up in the church and trying to find my way with the narrative of single mom and mesh that with the reality of how I grew up in the church, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I think really relates to this. It was very unexpected for you to be a single mom.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive into that. This is the Christmas episode, so we'll read the birth of Jesus foretold from Luke, and then we'll dive into your story.
Sounds good.
So in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Don't be afraid. Mary, you have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you're to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How can this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I'm a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who was said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word of the Lord will ever fail." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word be to me fulfilled." And the angel left her. So you know better than me, but tell me, how does that relate to your story?
Yeah, I definitely resonate with it. And obviously, it's a very holy story.
Right.
But I still resonate with it. And I think sometimes it's hard to want to resonate with something. It's like, that's so holy. How can I resonate with it so deeply? And I think I struggle with that a little bit. And also, I have to get past that. And I'm like, wow, it just lands for me when I read it, and I feel like I can enter in really deeply. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I also know you, and I know you're not arrogant and proud. Like, I know you're very humble. And so I think that's part of what makes the Bible living and active, is the ability for it. 2,000 years later, it's relevant.
Yeah.
So maybe we could talk about a little bit about your story. So for you, it was very unexpected to be pregnant.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what went through your mind when you found out you were pregnant? And I know you talked about this in your story,
That's
but
okay. I'll try not to do too many repeats. Kind of the first thing was, even in the story you just read, of God spoke out the word and then it was fulfilled. And I think that's the first thing that kind of went through my mind too, of like, I remember at the time, it would have been 3 years prior to that, to finding out I was pregnant, of being like, wow, I remember God spoke this word into my life that I didn't realize was true. I mean, I believed him in a sense, but you know, when you're learning to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit, you can always hold it loosely.
Right.
If you're like, oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
But just that sense of, wow, something is being fulfilled, and who am I to argue or resist it? And I think that's a piece that I resonate with Mary, is she just came to this place of acceptance in what I view kind of quickly. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some time that maybe it's not showing us the whole timeline, but it seems as if she came to that acceptance very quickly. And so I would say I felt similarly, because knowing what God had said to me 3 years prior of, you're going to be a mom in this particular year. Yeah, it just felt like it was fulfilling, I guess. And so, of course, that didn't eliminate all of the anxieties that came with it. That's what makes me want to enter in so deeply into Mary's story, is we don't get a huge snapshot of how she actually really felt.
Yeah.
We do, and we don't know her thoughts either, more than just what she said in that small passage. And so, I'm sure she must have had anxieties too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can get more into that and
Yeah.
in her context, what that would have been like. But knowing that it had been fulfilled as something that God had said went hand in hand with feeling some anxiety. And I think there's some tendency to want to make it either or, right? It's either been fulfilled and I'm great and I'm super at peace with it.
Right.
Or I'm super anxious about it and like, there's no way this could have been God.
Right. Yeah.
But I think there's something to be said about that, some lament and some joy being sisters in that.
I think you're right. There's been several times in my life where God has said, you're going to do this. And then it's like time comes and you're like, oh, wow, no thanks. Like, this is very scary. But also at the same time, some part of me is like, well, I mean, I don't want to miss out.
Right.
Like, what is it that he's calling me to do? But when I read that, I'm like, wow, Mary must have I know when I found out I was pregnant with my son and my daughter, I was hoping and expecting that I would be pregnant. Like, and I was surprised. So I'm like, if I was surprised and I was hoping for that to happen, imagine Mary, she had done none of the things that usually lead to children. And so that would be like somebody telling me I'm the keynote speaker at an accounting conference. Like, I've done nothing to deserve or want that position. But totally out of the blue. And she seems to just have this surrender to God that's like, okay, great. Yeah. And I don't know if that's really, like you said, we don't know her emotions or her feelings, but wow, so cool. So I also wonder, our societies are not that different. They're very different, but they're not that different in the view of single women being pregnant.
Right.
So what was it like for you to be pregnant in a church context? And I also know you talked about this in your story, but maybe we'll just really focus on this aspect. Were there times that you felt, we'll talk about times you felt judged and times you felt accepted, but maybe we'll start with judged first, and never want to throw anybody under the bus.
Absolutely.
But you can just still talk about the experiences if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I sure can. I think the main difference is obviously in Mary's situation, there was like a judgment, even physically, right? Like there was a physical safety.
Right. Yes.
That she was coming up against. And I think I had times where I felt judged and I felt like that emotional safety was more at risk. And I mean, I talk about it in my story where I come at it from a place of privilege, where I really feel like I had a surprisingly positive experience with a lot of people. And so when I was reflecting on, what were the moments that I really felt judged? And some of that's coming from myself probably, of I'm perceiving what I think other people are thinking. And I think we have to be careful with that too.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, so there's probably a mix of that in it. So when I was reflecting on it, I don't think I had one remark or comment that was rooted in judgment that kind of caught me off guard.
Wow, that's awesome.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, well, why did I still feel judged then? And because I definitely felt that, those eyes on me, eyes of judgment. And I think it was kind of the runaround of people's questions that weren't directed at me. Because, I had people come to me saying, well, this person's wondering, what happened? These people are just talking amongst themselves. And so, maybe more so it was just gossip that made me feel judged. And I have no idea what people said behind my back. And I don't even know if there was anything negative. I just don't know, right? You want to assume the best.
Yeah.
But I know people talked. And so you wonder what was said. And I think the part of that made me feel the most judged, I suppose, was that they didn't ask me for my story. I know that people didn't want to offend me.
Yeah.
But I think there's a place where I wished people had come up to ask me, I would love to know your story, right? And there's a place to ask about it if you're actually curious, where I'm happy to share instead of, or what happened to you, right? Or like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
There's two different ways of approaching it. So I think because I had one person that wasn't a close friend the whole pregnancy that actually came up to me and asked me, tell me your story. I'd love to sit down with you and hear.
Wow.
But only one person. And I know that so many people, I think there's a lot of people that still wonder, to be honest.
Well, they'll find out now.
Come ask me. Yeah. Just that piece of stigmatizing it by not talking about it. Right.
Yep. And just ask to your face, and that's not as big of a deal as everybody thinks.
Right. Because when I think when you pull back your questions, you create the stigma, you continue the stigma around it. So I think that was the biggest thing.
Yeah.
And that's when I personally started feeling that belonging kind of gain some friction, I guess, in the church for me, of wanting to be here. And I still was here, but of like, I know people are wondering. And no one's asking me in love. Right. And it's not trying to figure it out if it was right or wrong. Just wanting to hear people's stories and valuing something that might be different than what you believed. All but what this podcast is about.
I was just going to say, preach. Right? Yeah, that's good. And that's the thing, right? But we do get scared to actually. It feels a little awkward being like, I'm sure something's going on here. Tell me your story, but at the same time, how do we ever learn what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes? Because we can't all walk in each other's shoes. So the story is a really great way to at least get a glimpse. Yeah. So I was thinking about, well, what are those things that people did say to me that if you want to move on to even the accepting part of I'd love to hear that. People's reactions, and what were those words and phrases that we can, even myself, learn to use for people's stories that are different than mine, so that I'm not in that judgment camp. Yeah, I'd love to hear that. And so that first one really just being, I'd love to sit down with you and hear your story. I remember those words really clearly that someone said to me. And I'm not even sure I ever did with that person, to be honest, like time got away or whatever, but just the fact that there was that intentionality behind it. I think people appreciate that. And if they don't want to share, they won't, It's very easy to be like, yeah, sure, I'll text you, and then don't. But that sticks with you. Yeah, it does. You kind of feel accepted in just that comment. Yeah. And something else that I've had people say to me, words around holding space for you. So they would say something like, and these are good friends of mine, I'm not sure how you're feeling about it right now, but I'm holding space for whatever it does. Or no matter what happened, I'm just holding space for those in-betweens. Spaces of your life that might not fit in to that dominant narrative. So just the holding space. I'm happy to hear those in-between spaces, and just those comments about valuing the gray areas. Even not even asking, but just making those comments about, I see you. And it feels so validating when you're in that place where you think you're going to be judged, when someone comes up and says, wow, I see you, and I see the in-between space, and I hold space for you. And I think that just bridges belonging back in when it could be so easily severed. I think that's really cool. And what I like about that word space, I know it's a bit buzzwordy. It is. But I like it because it's like, they're not saying you have to fit into this box on this shelf. It's like, there's space, however big or however small, whatever you need, there's room for you at this table or at this church or wherever, right? Like there's room for you in this community, whatever that looks like. So I really like that as well. So yeah, that's cool. And I think too about tell me your story, it values the person, right? Yeah. It doesn't just say like, whoa, what happened to you? Like that wasn't part of the plan, which like people could have said to Mary. I'm sure they were talking behind her back too. I'm sure. We don't read it, but I'm sure that they were. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what that must have been like for her, especially like knowing what she knew, that this was the Son of God and she's trying to tell people, but like she would sound insane. Right. And how did she deal with that, I wonder? But it's neat to hear your story, to get just a glimpse into would that have been like?
Right? And
Yeah.
I'm sure people think that my story sounds insane when you're like, well, God told you that was going to happen. And yet, they believe something rooted in sin could come from God. Do you know what I mean?
Right. I do.
I think that's the insanity that people probably struggle with in the church with my story.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because like Jesus entered into, like I said, I think in the intro, but he entered into the gray area. Like
Right.
he entered into the world through a unwed mom who had to ride a donkey and was born in a stable. Imagine being born, having to have a baby in a parking lot. Like that's where they parked their donkeys. Like that's,
Yes.
and that's just not the way a king should be born or a baby in general. Like how crazy. And I think by doing that, he was showing that like he can actually make something beautiful and glorious out of the gray, right? Like out of all the different stories that come our way of the people of the unwed moms, of the people that don't belong into our church-sized box, right? Like what does that actually look like? And I know in your story, you talk about the walls falling down of this box that you were in.
Yeah.
Something like that vision God gave you. Well, that has stuck with me because I just think like, but wouldn't it be cool if metaphorically those walls could come down and people could just come and see Jesus and we just got out of the way.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of a phrase that I hold with me at Christmas when I think about this, and it's that there's so much vulnerability in the incarnation. And I think when there's those metaphorical walls up, people who feel like they have those areas of vulnerability in the church, right? Like maybe they don't fit in for whatever reason, are kept out. But yeah, when the walls could metaphorically fall down and we value and welcome vulnerability to the highest extent, that, like that's where the belonging could happen. And we look at the Christmas story and there was so much vulnerability in being born as a baby.
Yes.
In the incarnation. And that's the part that I like to sit with the most almost, is just the vulnerability, and then the vulnerability that I feel in, the decision that I made to have Kinsley and decisions in telling everyone the story. And I resonate with that vulnerability piece.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I think that's neat. I want to also talk about Joseph and talking about just gray areas and all those things. And we were talking before we started recording, but one thing I just think is so interesting, because we gotta include the guys here, is Joseph was doing something very noble. If you aren't familiar, he said in Matthew, he said he'd made it up in his mind to quietly divorce Mary, which in those days was like, wow, you are very admirable, like very merciful, very gracious, because he could have had her stoned and that would have been fine. I mean, thankfully that's not what happens now.
Right.
But that would have been okay. So quietly divorcing her was like, wow, you're a good guy. And then the angel told him, no, Mary's telling the truth and don't divorce her, stay with her. And because he chose to believe God, he got to have a parent-child relationship with his creator.
Yeah, that's
like how amazing is that? And our awesome producer Ryan was talking beforehand about how we see how Jesus actually did what a son would do with his father. Joseph was a carpenter and Jesus took that up, and it's just so neat. And what if he had missed out on that because he was like, no, that's not what we do.
Right.
This is not normal behavior. What if he had just, I'm doing the right thing here, Lord. What if he had said that? Because he kind of was. But it just goes to show, like, when God speaks, it doesn't always make sense. And what happens when we trust him?
Yeah. I think that even resonates with me on Joseph's side too. It's you have to be okay with some box breaking.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard for a lot of us, for everyone probably.
Yeah.
But there's so much to come from it when we let God break down what we thought we knew and bless the boxes that we leave behind and takes us into a new place.
Yeah. Okay, so I also want to talk about, I never ever, first of all, want to say that the Bible is missing something or that it's not right. So I'm not saying that, but I am sort of having a giggle when I read Luke 2, and it says, it's talking about Mary and Joseph. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to a firstborn, a son. Do you feel like there might be a lot of details missing, like clearly written by Luke, a man who was not aware of what happened?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's comical because
It is.
It was a lot messier than what they've just said.
Right.
And I feel like it's almost a sanitization of what happened for the comfort of everyone reading it.
Yes, I totally agree. And it's so funny because I also feel like there's something very profound about, well, you can speak to this. You've talked about this before, but just agony that goes into having a child. And not to mention, I had 2 babies in a hospital, like pretty comfy.
Right?
Can you imagine like sitting on straw and dirt and like cows mooing beside you? And you're like, this is where the Son of God is being born. Shouldn't he be somewhere safer or cleaner? But no, it was messy and probably painful. And well, I mean, I can pretty much guarantee it was painful,
Yeah.
and not silent at all.
No.
So, I know you had talked a bit about that before, but I'll let you take the floor.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, even that silent part is where I like to start, because I really don't think that Jesus came out not crying. Right?
In fact, that would be considered a medical problem.
That's exactly what I thought. You want him to cry.
Wait,
His lungs are working.
Yes.
So I just think when we talk about him, not crying, or we skip over the messiness and the agony, the pain that you were talking about, we miss out on so much of where Jesus wants to meet us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love to just think about our own birth stories to relate, obviously, to what might have been happening, to skip some of the gory details. There's a lot of pain and mess. And it always just makes me think about the parts of my life, not physically necessarily, but, just all the parts that might be painful or messy.
Mm-hmm.
And how if we skip over that part of Jesus and his incarnation in this world, we miss out on so much of how God can meet us in our own messy parts. Because if we don't think that Mary's birth and Jesus coming out screaming and all messy and bloody, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
we miss that might be one of the holiest moments.
Yes.
And I think of it like that. And then we start to get this narrative of, well, I have to have it all put together.
Right, exactly.
Because if something happens that's messy or painful, well, that's not a holy moment. How could God meet me there? And I think that the holy night was in the part that it doesn't talk about, of Jesus being born in all of the vulnerability and the mess and the pain that we experience every day that maybe we just don't talk about, right?
Yeah, I love that, Kristen. I'm sure for you, I don't know if this is a firstborn thing, but when I had my son, I will say, and it's not because I don't love my daughter, but my son, my first baby being born, was the single greatest moment of my life. And I know I'm supposed to say my wedding, but that was just I was very busy.
That's okay.
But the thing about having your first baby, it's like, I just think it's hormonal for sure, moment, but you just feel instantly bonded, and it's this happiest moment of your life, even though you went through this incredible pain, 9 months of pregnancy. I felt like a million. And then birth is hard. It just is. Even if you're medicated, it's hard. And it, like you said, it's messy. But then at the end, you get this baby and you get this like bond. By the way, I know that lots of moms don't have that their first time, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
And so we don't know, maybe Mary didn't feel that immediately, but I know it's possible.
Yeah.
And I also know that I didn't for my daughter.
Okay.
And it wasn't for lack of love. It was just, and maybe Mary felt like this too. I was very surprised because she was born very quickly.
Right.
And so I was processing that for weeks, but I still have a very close, loving, sweet, intimate relationship with my daughter. So either way, whether Mary was like elated like I was with my son, or surprised and processing for weeks, I still think how cool that Jesus was born as a baby in a humble way, fully relying on his mom and meeting us in the middle of that mess and pain and anguish and bringing about incredible joy, and so much joy that you forget. Like it says in the Bible, your mother forgets the pain because they have this baby. I did it again, clearly. Because I forgot. And so I think that's one of the cool things is Jesus came in and he like met Mary in the middle of this mess and made it all worth it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really cool point that you bring up about the mess.
Yeah, that even reminded me of a few years ago. I remember the Holy Spirit speaking to me about that, the spiritual reality of what you just said, of we can think about times in our life that do feel really hard or painful or messy as, maybe a spiritual reality of God trying to birth something in us, like something is coming. And we think of it as, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong, or, maybe God's against me. But really, what if we're pregnant with hope spiritually for something that is coming that he wants to give to us in our lives. And I think that could be a spiritual reality for both men and women, right?
I totally agree.
I look at that part of the Christmas story and I think, wow, I'm quick to assume that hard parts of my life are just hard and not pregnant with hope of something that could come, that God wants to bring in, that could bring that great joy, right? And it's those seasons.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's a spiritual reality there for us to think about too.
Yeah. How do we get to the place where when we're in those hard times. Like Mary's Magnificat in Luke 2. Like if you haven't read it, you should read it. I'm not going to sing it. I assume she sang it. Anyway, but how do we get to a place where we respond when God's like, hey, you're going to go through this really, really crazy journey? And we're like, great. I mean, I'm sure that took her some time, but how do we respond with the way Mary did? I don't know if that might be.
I don't know either. I think of one of my favorite authors. I definitely mentioned her last time,
Yes.
Sarah Bessey.
Yeah.
She has an Advent devotional, and she breaks it into 4 pieces. And I wonder if it speaks a little bit to that question you just asked. She talks about waiting, and then accepting, and then journeying, and then birthing. And I wonder if it's just part of it, maybe being aware of how long we spend in each of those phases and knowing that, the Holy Spirit will evolve each of those phases with us and for us, so maybe it takes me a long time to accept, but knowing that there's this journey and I don't have to do it by myself afterwards gives me some peace. And then, and I think that journey is supposed to be rooted in community. And then that brings you to this birthing that comes maybe into this great joy, whatever it may be for you, right?
Yeah.
So I like how she splits that up. And so maybe it's how we take up each of those things. And I love celebrating Advent or thinking or reflecting on Advent in those stages for myself. And I really love that devotional because, it just resonates with so many different parts of our lives when we think about those stages.
Yeah, I love that. I love that a lot. And the thought coming to mind right now is the Prince of Peace and how we talk about joy and love and peace a lot at Christmas time, right? And it's so interesting that when we do talk about this messy Christmas story, it seems like those would be the furthest words from what I would use to describe that time, right? Love, joy, peace. And yet that's what he brought. Was those things. And so I love that. And I kind of want to wrap it up with talking a little bit about just the people that came to see Jesus and the people that he reaches. And so if you have a nativity set, there are shepherds and there are wise men. I want to talk about who are those in our world today and who are the people that Jesus has come to save. I mean, the default answer is everyone. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the people in our lives that we think don't fit into the black and white boxes of church, and how can we be intentional about sharing Jesus with the people in the gray areas? And frankly, I think we're all in the gray areas.
Yeah,
so,
if we're honest.
Yeah, if we're honest. But how do we be intentional about bringing Jesus with us as we go into the gray area, or maybe just finding him in the gray area is the better way to say it? If we're looking at the Christmas story, who jumps off the page to you of people in our society today that we could be intentional with?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
It was very long. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I really just think it's people who we don't assume fit into our dominant narrative of the walls of our church, right? Even the metaphorical ones. So, I mean, with my bias, I do think of, single moms and people who might not feel welcome. I think of people in the LGBTQ community and, people, they might not feel welcome for maybe similar reasons of belonging and beliefs. And you talked about homeless people. Like, do we just walk past them? Right. And I think all these categories that we could list, I think we can really bring Jesus when we think about wanting to go full circle here, go back to hearing their stories and let it not be about beliefs, like really. Yeah. And know that Jesus is walking alongside us as we walk alongside their stories. Yeah. And I think that's who Jesus would be hanging out with anyways, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's where I get, a little stuck too with the walls of the church. I'm like, well, where would Jesus be?
Right. Okay. So, I want to go back to when you said that how can a moment this messy be holy? Well, if I'm being fully transparent, we just took a little pause break there and our producer Ryan spoke some really amazing words. So he's going to hop on in a second, but I do want to talk about, how we have sanitized Christmas. In a way, we make it this like very, very clean. Like, I don't know about you, my nativity set, if my kids touch it, they are in big trouble. But if you look closely, we have a 3-legged sheep. Even our nativity set is broken. I want to talk about the messy, I could testify to the messiest times of my life where I have been the most disobedient or the most angry or hurt. That's when God did the biggest life change for me. And I wouldn't want it to happen again, but I also wouldn't change it. And so maybe in a way I do want it to happen again. I think by being born in the context that he was, it shows that he was not afraid. He is so holy that he can enter those moments and make them holy. Right? Like the dirtiest, stinkiest of moments. And he's like, yeah, well, I'm enough, even as a baby. And like he was fully God and fully man in this teeny tiny body. Yeah. I heard Pastor Kyle once, he's a pastor at the church that we attend, and he said, Christianity is the only religion that celebrates human failures. A lot of other religions, you try to work hard to be as good as you can be. But in Christianity, Jesus is like, when you are weak, then I am strong. I just find that amazing that he's that holy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that every year Christmas comes around because we need to be reminded of that. Because you said earlier, how do we change our perspective on those hard things? And to automatically saying, wow, this is a holy moment. God is here. Like, how do we change our perspective to actually go right there?
And
right?
Go into the mess.
Right. And I think that's what makes me so glad that we celebrate Christmas once a year, because I need the reminder once a year to reflect during Advent and lean into hard spaces as a practice. Because when those things come, and if we don't have that practice or discipline to lean in as something holy, we're not going to train our mind to automatically want to go there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the beautiful things of Advent for me personally, is I get to practice leaning into the hard waiting of whatever it might be.
Yeah, I love that. And we had talked about how Jesus actually would have hung out with all the people in the gray area. And it reminded me of a story in Luke 19 about Zacchaeus and the tax collector. And I'll just summarize it. But basically, Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. Jesus is in town and this crowd surrounds him. And Zacchaeus is not well liked, and he's a wealthy tax collector. So he's kind of on the outskirts, but he wants to see Jesus. So he climbs a tree, and Jesus sees him and goes, Zacchaeus, I'm going to eat at your house tonight. And Zacchaeus is like, oh, cool. Okay. So they have dinner. I don't know. I paraphrase. He didn't say, okay, cool. But I think the challenges for us is that not everyone is going to climb a tree to see Jesus. And how often are we, the crowd, blocking people's view of him? And how can we be better at creating a pathway? And so still looking at Jesus, we never want to take our eyes off of him. Right. But how do we, instead of blocking people out, how do we clear the path so that people can see him too, and they don't have to climb a tree?
Right.
Of course, the tree is a metaphor, but
yeah.
So for me, I think about, like you had said, the homeless people. I think in Matthew, it says, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And so not only is Jesus saying, I love people who are going through homelessness, he's saying, I am going through homelessness. I was born without a home. And the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. Not only does he love them, he is them. He is the son of a single mom. He is born in that family. And that's probably who he'd rather hang out with. He's probably more comfortable with the outcast, because if we aren't sure if he's an outcast, we just have to look at the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Clearly not well liked. So how can we be intentional? I guess that's for me the challenge this Christmas, and hopefully beyond that, is who are the people that I've been blocking from seeing Jesus? Yeah. And how do we make a path for them?
Yeah. I think that even desanitizing it a bit, it helps make that pathway clear. It starts to make that pathway a bit clear. I think it helps people who feel like their life is messy, aren't coming into a place that's sanitized.
Yes. How do we do that? Because it's not like we're going to just rub dirt on the walls of the building. But how do we pursue excellence? Because I do believe God is excellent. And if we can do our best, then we should. But how do we unsanitize the view of the church? Do you have any ideas on that?
The word that comes to mind is vulnerability. I think we just need to be better at being vulnerable. And
I like that.
I think that can, and again, sometimes people might view it as the either or, vulnerability or excellence. I think it can be both and.
I agree.
And I think that's maybe the first step.
I love that. Yeah. So in this day and age, just some practical ideas. I know one thing I'm passionate about is social media. So for me, I try to be pretty vulnerable on social media, but I walk the line because I also love beautiful things. And I think that's okay. So I often will post what I think is a beautiful photo with a very real caption about
love it,
what I'm going through. So I think that's one way we can that's a really passive way, but if you're just getting started and being vulnerable, that's a good place to start. Just kind of bare your heart on social media a little bit more. But also there's person to person stuff. How do you had mentioned people asking you to share their story. Have you been able to do that with other people? And what's that been like if you have?
I wish I could say that I've had the chance. And honestly, COVID, and I feel like I haven't gotten back to sitting down with people for coffee like I used to love to do. But since COVID and since having Kinsley,
I was going to say, mom life is...
I know.
Yeah.
But so I am not perfect at this at all. But if I think back to when I had time to sit down with people, I know one thing that I used to love to do was just inviting people to go for coffee with me. And with the intention of that, Like, I just love to hear more about you and hear more about your story.
Yeah.
And I mean, at least before COVID, people were pretty receptive to that.
Yeah, I think we're getting there.
I think we're
I
getting there.
hugged someone today.
That's a big step.
I know, and it wasn't my kids. Yeah, I think you're right. I also think our view, we have to just be so intentional about challenging who can be in a church. And so I'll just give an example of the other day. There was a guy in our church's atrium, I guess, and he had a sign asking for cash. And my first thought was, what is he doing here? And then my second thought was like, oh, that's great, because where else should he come if he needs money or food or shelter? Like, isn't this where?
Yeah.
And I was like, that's awesome. But why was my first thought, he should not be here? And so those are the kind of uncomfortable, I was so uncomfortable with it that I thought that. And I'm like, but I have to lean into that. Why do I feel that way? I'm so uncomfortable that I just said that, because I never want people to misinterpret that I feel the way my first thoughts were, because I don't. But if I'm going to challenge other people to think about these thoughts, then I guess I should be honest about them too. Because the reality is, like, Jesus did come for everybody.
Yeah.
And if we lock people out of that, then we're not doing a very good job of being his hands and feet in the world.
Yeah.
So challenge, I think it does start from those thoughts.
Yeah. And if I could add one more thing to that too, in the other episode that I was on, I talked about not wanting to necessarily go to a mom's group.
Right.
If
yes.
everyone else is married, everyone else looks the same and I look different. And I've been challenging myself to go. And I want to share just the power of vulnerability in that I've had to kind of grapple with, is that I took Kinsley to the play place. Kinsley's my daughter. And it was a time that there wasn't anyone else there except for one mom that I hadn't ever met before. And a lot of time went by before we actually started chatting, only for me to come to discover that she is also not together with the dad of one of her
Wow.
kids. And this was her first time at the play place. And that was an outreach thing where she had come and to take her kids to play. But it was her first time. And I just remember thinking, well, what if I hadn't come and she thought everyone in the church still had,
Totally.
their life put together, whatever. Not saying her life wasn't put together, but we have this idea of what people in the church look like. And it was so life-giving for me to be like, I might not have even shared that about myself, but because I did, we had that moment of vulnerability where we were able to connect, and we're in the church and it's a place where Jesus is. And even though we didn't have to say that, it's the power of vulnerability where Jesus can enter in without needing to say his name.
Yeah.
And
the
for people to
acceptance.
feel welcome. Yeah, because
Yes.
Jesus is in that welcome.
Yeah. Oh, that's so, so good. I think too about groups of people in the throes of addiction. Part of my role is I get to do a lot of interviewing, and I have met so many people who I had no idea struggled with addiction to alcohol or drugs or pornography. And you're going to hear another one of those. You're going to hear a story from a guy named Brett, but he's been on the podcast talking about his addiction. And these are people that you would never know. And it's funny, like, as soon as they tell me their stories, I'm like, what? And my first thought is like, wow, I didn't know people like that could be in the church. And then I'm like, people like that, like, look at myself in the mirror. I have things too that I struggle with, right? And so I love what you said about being vulnerable, because to enter into the gray area of life, you have to be vulnerable with yourself and honest with yourself. But what are the things that I struggle with? Because then all of a sudden you're on the same playing field as everybody else.
Right.
So, like, I might not have an alcohol addiction, but I have other things that I'm dealing with, and I'm not any better than anybody else.
For another episode.
Yes. And other people's stories are really, really important in challenging those thoughts. So that's a really cool thing to learn about the Christmas story, is really Jesus did transcend all the gray areas that we could have possibly imagined. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's good for me.
Okay, so we were just talking about all the people that came to see Jesus, and our awesome producer, Ryan, he just raised his hand and said, I got to share something about the wise men that came to visit. And so he shared this thought, and he's like, you guys can tell it. And I was like, Ryan, nobody can say it like you just did. So Ryan hopped on a mic, and can you tell us your thoughts about the wise men?
Well, it's interesting to be on this side of the microphone, actually. Yeah, sure. I've always, growing up, listening to the Christmas story and having the opportunity to experience the Christian story from the Catholic lens, they don't talk much about the wise men. Like, the wise men always seem to me to be these tangents to the story. They come into the story and they just to give gifts, and then they kind of just disappear, and not much is mentioned about them afterwards.
And they bring the worst gifts. Like if someone brought that to me at my baby shower, I'd be like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah, it's what's really interesting about those gifts is that they are all gifts that are befit to a king.
Yes,
And
of
of
course.
course,
But
yeah.
that is a really good point. Excellent point. I was just kind of trying to throw it up, be funny, but
And
you're
what's
right.
really cute is I remember I wasn't a member of the FAC church until a couple of years ago.
That's the church that we are recording in.
Yeah,
currently.
exactly. And one of the things that one of the pastors did at the church I was going to is he actually brought frankincense and myrrh to the sermon, and he gave people little baggies to take home. We still have the frankincense and myrrh in our nativity scene. We put that
Wow.
as the treasures at the feet of the wise men whenever we set up our nativity scene every year. Also including this scrap piece of gold that I had around the house. It was an
laying
old pinky ring I had, and it got squashed, so I figured, gold was part of the nativity, so here we go.
There you
But
go.
it's interesting. I've always looked at the wise men and thought, okay, they came, they gave these gifts. It seemed like they had some sort of insight into what had happened that nobody else had. And for the life of me, I was like, why don't people sermonize about this? Why don't people
Sermonize.
talk about it? That's probably not a word.
I like it. It might be.
It could be. So at the church I was at, the pastor at the time was a guy by the name of George Budd, Okotoks Evangelical Free Church, for those who care to know. And he preached an entire sermon on just the wise men, who they were, where they came from, and what their motivations were. And he gave a interesting sermon, and I'm going to end up paraphrasing some of the things he said because I can never truly remember all the things, but what stuck out to me the most is that he said, above all things, the wise men were stargazers. They looked into the skies like astrologers would. They gazed at the stars to see what the stars were going to foretell, in a manner of speaking. And around the time that the Star of David appeared, they would have been privy to some information that isn't really spoken too much about. Because according to the laws of their mysticism, the Star of David appeared in the house of Jupiter. Now, a lot of people are like, okay, what exactly does that mean? Well, to the stargazers, it would have been significant because it would have signified that a person was born, a king. But because the Star of David was so big and bright, it overshadowed all the other stars.
Oh, wow.
So the stargazers immediately went, a king of kings was just born. We got to go find this guy. It's like God stretched out his hand and invited people who would have been completely excluded from biblical story or being part of this experience, and gave them an invitation to, hey guys, you got to come over here and see what just happened here. Something very significant just happened and you don't want to miss out on it. He invited people in to the Christmas story who would have been excluded because of, their cultural traditions, religions, beliefs, other
Yeah.
things like that.
That's cool.
And I think every Christmas, that's always one of the things that jumps into my head is it's the opportunity for us as Christians and believing Christians to invite in people who are marginalized or
Yeah.
would be excluded from the experience of Jesus in its entirety.
I think that's really cool, Ryan, especially because, one of the things we sometimes say is like, oh, well, we all see the same moon and the same sun. And how cool that God was like, I'm going to use the thing that everybody has in common. We all can see the sky wherever you're at in the world. And he's going to use that to communicate that his son is born. And it's like, whoa, that's a very universal mode of communication.
Yeah. And we didn't even touch on the shepherds either, because
Right.
they had a very unique experience. Like, they got to see the heavenly host. Any biblical description you see of angels, one angel is like an awe-striking presence. But to imagine a legion,
Could you imagine?
all declaring, glory to God in the Most High and peace among earth to all men. Like, if you were the shepherds, after you've changed your clothes, because let's be fair, you're like,
I was just going to say.
you'd be like,
no, seriously.
whoa.
So I have always thought, maybe I'm wrong here, but I've always thought of the shepherds as sort of equaling the people that we think of are kind of dirty and kind of on the margins of society who like most people don't want to hang out with because they smell. That's how I've always thought of them in today's context. And I love that they got the legion of angels. I mean, they were probably terrified, but also, whoa, what an honor.
Yeah. Growing up on a farm myself, I know exactly maybe not exactly what it's like to be a shepherd, but you tend to feel of yourself that all of these urban things that happen, Like, everybody talks about what happens in the big cities, what's on the news, celebrity gossip, things like that. But you're like these humble people living on the fringes of society, doing work that keeps that urban society upheld with the wool you produce as a shepherd, or the meat that your sheep produce, or the milk that cattle produce, or the grain that you sow in your fields. And you kind of feel excluded in a certain sense. You're off to the side of everything. And I think those shepherds, the angels appearing and saying, look, something really important just happened very close to you. Go and see it.
Yeah.
Is another invitation for the people who feel like maybe they don't belong in society or belong in a church setting, or like they don't belong in general.
Yeah.
To just come. Just come.
Like laid out all the stops. Here's the invitation. Like just, yeah, that's incredible. I love that point of view, and thank you for sharing that. So
it was just going to be a ladies episode, and then they're like, no, we got to include the gents somewhere.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, I mean, hey, really, there's only one woman even mentioned in the story. So you have to include the guys. But anyway, thanks, Ryan, for sharing those thoughts. That was such a great episode. Thank you so much, Kristen, for coming back for a second episode. And no episode of the Can We Ask You This podcast would be complete without our very own Pastor Corey. So...
Hello, everyone. Just jumping in here. Actually, as you may have guessed, I was not there at the recording, but I'm excited just to jump in and wish you all a Merry Christmas. And we're so grateful for you listening and sharing the podcast with friends and family. I know it's been encouraging for me being able to listen to everyone's story so far, and I'm so excited about the upcoming stories that we have.
Yeah, so we've had quite a few good conversations this year already, and I don't know, I always feel very, very reflective this time of year, and it's very cool to think about. We've recorded 5-6 episodes, so you have that to look forward to, but I feel like it's exciting to think about how we've recorded those, we've heard them, but we get to look forward to the new year and all those stories coming out and more interviews to happen and lots to look forward to.
Yeah, lots to look forward to, and always appreciate Ryan for him jumping in on this podcast.
Yeah.
But also just the time and energy that he gives to putting this all together. So yeah, it's been a wonderful journey, and it's really just the beginning. So we're excited for the future. Thank you for being a part of our listener community. And yeah, we appreciate you.
Yeah. And before we go, it is a Christmas episode. So Corey, what is one Christmas tradition that you do as a family, or I don't know, on your own, whatever?
This is more a Santa Christmas tradition. So we go to the Bass Pro Shop, get our free Santa photo.
Cool. That's a big store here in Calgary.
Yes.
For those that aren't local.
Bass Pro Shop. It's basically like an outdoorsy shop with all things outdoorsy.
They are
it's
not
magnificent.
sponsoring us.
Yeah, this is not sponsored by Bass Pro.
But, okay, so you do that. That's
yeah,
fun.
we do that. It's been really fun collecting all the Santa photos. So just something simple and fun.
That's good.
Yeah. What about yourself?
We started this during COVID lockdown. I started making activity advent calendars. So basically, it's a really good way for me to make sure we do all of the fun Christmas traditions that we want to do, but just spacing them out throughout the month. And so we start that December 1st, and it goes all the way till Christmas. Sometimes it's like color a picture of a Christmas tree. And other times it's go tobogganing or watch a Christmas movie, or we have one where it's like the kids are going to take their allowance and go buy something for the food bank. So that's kind of a cool one too. So I love the Advent calendar. It's just fun to look forward to it and anticipate Christmas Eve. So
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for joining us on this special episode, and we hope you'll keep on listening.
have a very, very Merry
Merry
Christmas.
Christmas.
Bye-bye.
Bye.